Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our conference, Urban Diplomacy and City Diplomacy from the Micro to the Macro. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Kathleen Arnold. Professor Arnold is a professor and director of the Refugee and Forced Migration Program at DePaul University. She's a political theorist who has written extensively on statelessness, displacement, and poverty. And she's just published a book on migrant protest, which is her sixth single-authored book. Katie, if I may, teaches from an intersectional perspective, including assigning texts that are critical of the philosophical canon and centrist and or realist approaches to international organizations. She often works with students on justice-oriented projects and is engaged in grassroots activity in the Chicago area, as well as serving as an expert witness in asylum cases. Now, via conversations with the school director, David Wellman, in planning this conference, I came across Professor Arnold's work this year in the form of her 2022 journal article titled Sanctuary, is in a Trumpist context, creating spaces of democratic exception. This was a serendipitous discovery on my part. I love the title and I went from there. Now, as mentioned a moment ago, Professor Arnold has written extensively on statelessness. Katie argues that statelessness is endemic to the modern condition and it's not anomalous. She was inspired, I understand, to write a book based on Hannah Arendt's famous claim that during the interwar and World War II eras, it was better to be a criminal than a stateless person. And the argument was that this was because the criminal, even though treated as an exception, still had a range of rights and was treated as a person before the law. In contrast, the stateless person was essentially a non-person and yet criminalized in such a way that they became an outlaw. Katie is working currently on projects related to faith-based sanctuary, detainee protests such as hunger strikes, and theories of sovereignty. Now, following Professor Arnold's remarks, we will have a Q&A portion of the session. And so you, the audience, are asked to submit your written questions via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, and I will direct your questions to our keynote speaker. So without further ado, Katie, you are very welcome. We look forward to hearing your remarks.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint presentation, but thank you for that introduction and thank you for your interest in my work. And this is maybe not going to happen. And I hope you can still hear me. Could someone tell me if they can hear me, just because sometimes my audio does shut off?
We
Yes,
can indeed hear you.
Okay, good.
Good. We see it now very clearly.
Okay. Great, thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group on dynamics of diplomacy in relation to the city of Chicago. I'm a political theorist and the director of the Refugee and Forced Migration Studies program at DePaul and have written quite a lot on sanctuary localities and faith-based sanctuary. I have also participated in faith-based sanctuary and currently direct an NGO, Sanctuary Now, and a linked student group, DePaul Sanctuary, that each support migrants in the Chicago area. Chicago is an important city for sanctuary activity, both in terms of sanctuary or welcoming ordinances and faith-based participation. The state was one of the first to develop a refugee resettlement program and has been a leader in progressive ordinances, policies, and norms. Today, I'm going to discuss sanctuary localities and faith-based sanctuary as two forms of resistance exercised by migrants and their supporters through the framework of applied diplomacy. First, I will broadly discuss the history of the emergence of transnational protest and the development of civil society groups and NGOs. These movements are an instance of marginalized people directly responding to exclusions generated by wealthier modern nation states of the global north that host forced migrants. Then I will discuss the specific historical context in which individuals and groups began to resist U.S. national security measures and narrow interpretations of the definition of refugee, beginning in the 1980s and then really exploding in the 1990s. And finally, I will discuss U.S. sanctuary more specifically. In the 1950s and 1960s, Hannah Arendt introduced a new perspective on the nation state, one that was less celebratory than previous accounts. The nation state had certainly provided contemporary forms of political representation, cultural identification, and wider membership. It pledged to protect the rights of man, which are inalienable rights and human rights, and citizen. When I teach classes on these rights, I explain to my students that while they are related, they are still distinct. The rights of man protect the rights to the means of existence. These are the rights, they are protective rights and provide acknowledgement of an individual's personhood, at least ideally. Citizenship rights are called positive rights by political philosophers. These are the rights to form associations, express ideas freely, and to vote. These two sets of related rights were advances over arrangements in feudal times and under absolute monarchy, both of which held that all human beings were unequal, that power elites were blessed by God and authorized to treat all others in that territory as subjects and not political actors with inherent human dignity. While these rights and guarantees had never been implemented perfectly in the global north, the emergence of eugenic racism in the late 1800s undermined their potential. As race became a pseudoscientific category in liberal representative democracies, certain people were deprived of citizenship rights, that is, the right to vote, to freely assemble, and to occupy public space. Their status as human was also put into question, right, and therefore their right to exist. As Arendt argued, the degree to which eugenic and or biopolitical concerns shaped access to nation-state acknowledgement and inclusion, this meant that these new political categories were not universally accessible to all long-term residents. In fact, mass displacement began to occur as liberal representative democracies began to develop totalitarian tools, removing certain groups based on their racialized status. At this moment, masses of people were displaced from their homes, and yet, as Arendt argues, in the modern era, had no new homeland in which to reside. Global North democracies began to treat arriving foreigners as racial pollutants, often placing them in camps rather than allowing them to integrate into that society. The same democracies also began to strip their own citizens of citizenship rights and duties, sometimes allowing for inalienable rights but not positive rights of citizenship. As Arendt argued, while the rights of man and citizen were supposed to be distinct, once an individual lost their citizenship, they also lost their human or inalienable rights. That is, they lost their right to exist. Arendt was writing about the Holocaust, but numerous countries forcibly displaced their members due to their status. Arriving foreigners from most of the globe to the US, for example, during the same time, were also treated as biologically inferior and were turned away. Accordingly, Arendt argued that the rights of man and citizen were effectively destroyed, as was the right to asylum. Because of these developments, refugee flows from the World War period to the present have been significant and unending. Even when eugenics was discredited in the post-Holocaust era, eugenic policies were still explicitly law in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, as well as informing foreign policy and international economic development, less explicitly in numerous global North countries. Human rights norms provided hope during this time that individuals could be protected from repressive and or racist norms, but these norms were only minimally enforceable. The refugee protocols of 1951 and 1967 also made the unfortunate distinction that you can see here between displacement inside or outside one's country of origin to recognize who was and who was not a legitimate refugee and therefore the worthy recipient of international aid. Groups subjected to colonization were not viewed as refugees because they were internally displaced, while those forced to flee their country were considered legitimate refugees. Nevertheless, even the latter group were still only protected to the degree that the nation state decided to adhere to refugee and other human rights protocols. In the 1990s, the explosion of ethnic conflict, forced displacement, and greater refugee flows demonstrated what Arendt had warned about. Certain nation states not only failed to protect their own people, but actively stripped them of political status, effectively making them stateless and vulnerable to mass atrocities. Nevertheless, unlike when Arendt was writing, the international sphere was no longer an anarchical society. Rather than international institutions had emerged, influencing regional politics and affecting individual country sovereignty. Civil society groups also emerged, some local, some transnational, mitigating the deleterious effects of economic development policies on the one hand, and making elite level promises of human rights possible at the local level on the other. Notably, women of the Global South who had been part of peace processes but were never allowed a seat at any official negotiating table successfully managed to have their voices heard in UN-sponsored conferences and their very important offshoots in the 1990s. Their demands and importance in negotiating peace were reflected in the passage of UN Resolution 1325 at this time. The emergence of global civil society, more accurately viewed as a transnational civil society, democratized the international sphere and allowed for grassroots democratic activity and representation. Rather than aiming at fixed identities, territorial claims, or homogeneous groupings, these civil society actors allowed for debate, diverse identities, and a multiplicity of views. They also often more directly represented or were led by people directly affected by key policies and issues. In this way, they were and are practitioners of direct democracy, fomenting an agonistic and deeply political space or set of spaces. Research on the importance of cities, cosmopolitanism, globalization, and a myriad of other terms and approaches exploded at this time. Important theories of these new developments emerged in the early 1990s, interpreting these new rights claims and political formations as cosmopolitan, renewing ideas of hospitality and moral duties rather than individualistic rights claims, and focusing on the urban area as a site of new rights claims and political relations. Post-national rights were claimed by Turkish migrant workers across Europe as Roma individuals held congresses and agitated for their rights on a non-territorial basis. Authors like Andrew Linklater drew on Hedley Bull's terms to argue that this was a time of neo-medievalism, which was and is a desirable form of democratic activity and productive tension. Transnational civil society actors, particularly NGOs, emerged to advocate on behalf of broad groups of people unaccounted for by the nation state. Linklater explains that neo-medievalism is modern and secular, involving a system of overlapping authority and multiple loyalties. He argues that we must conceive of duties beyond borders, moral equality, and citizenship as a system of political obligations not necessarily confined to the nation state. From cosmopolitan theory to theories of post-national rights, authors such as Yasmin Soysal to David Held to people who were attending this conference to Saskia Sassen argued that transnational civil society did not replace the nation state, but rather reduced its centrality to politics. The key was not to encourage democratization at the transnational level per se, but rather to recognize already existing groups and chains of cooperation between different spheres of political action. However, we can also recognize, particularly when considering sanctuary activism, that a decolonial perspective is necessary to understand how and why transnational activism is not merely replicating global North political forms, but rather staging an interaction between neo-imperial powers and subjugated others, as Julian Go has theorized, for example. Civil society groups exploded in the 1980s and 1990s with nonprofit human rights organizations at the forefront of this wave of democratization. Nevertheless, from the mid-1990s through the 2010s, global North borders were expanded and became more militarized. The use of border walls and fencing grew. Private security firms were increasingly utilized to police displaced peoples, and wealthy liberal representative democracies implemented harsh migration policies that conflated migrants with terrorists. After the events of 9/11, the literature on cities, cosmopolitics, and globalization briefly appeared to be idealistic and perhaps irrelevant until a few years later, as civil society actors regrouped and new ones emerged to form cities of solidarity, informal places of refuge, and sanctuary cities. As I'm going to explain, these cities do not aim at neutrality or political moderation, but directly oppose repressive migration policies, violent foreign policy, and importantly, cooperate with one another in various ways. Today, these groups and cities more explicitly oppose nation-state institutions than in the 1990s, I think, developing new political relationships and exposing injustices. They also resist what is sometimes called negative civil society, the explosion of hate groups and vigilante groups in the 9/11 era, recognizing that in this time, the nation state does not adequately speak for or protect minoritized individuals.
Yeah,
The field of
Katie, I
yes.
wonder if I can just interrupt. I wondered, I'm sorry to interrupt your flow there. Your PowerPoint is not coming through, and I wonder if you need to click anything to get that sort of started.
Okay, that's so strange. Thank you for telling me. I thought I was doing it this.
No,
Is it now?
Let's see. No, I'm seeing you at the moment, but not the PowerPoint. I don't know if
Okay.
that was sort
I'm
of meant to go
sorry.
sort of
That's so
automatic. That's
funny.
all
I've
right.
had like
No,
definitions up and so on and so forth.
no,
Let
we're
me see.
loving the talk.
I don't even see you guys anymore. Very sorry about that. And that's
Don't
disappointing.
worry.
Okay, I'm going to try to
No,
do
we're good.
this
No,
again.
you're amongst friends, Katie. So if you are able to fix it, that would be fantastic. If not, then that's we'll just press on. There you go. I see Chinese Exclusion Act and cases in front of me.
Okay. You know what? I might not go to full screen because that somehow, I don't know why, but maybe that's going to be the safest. And I'm sorry because you're going to end up seeing my other slides, but maybe not going to full screen. Okay,
Okay.
so everyone can see both at the moment.
Yes, I see the Magic Washer and Chinese Exclusion Act in front of me.
Okay. Yes. All right. Thank you for letting me know.
You're welcome.
My goodness. Okay. All
So
right. Oh,
there we
no,
go.
no, no. Better to have told me. Thank you. So the field of diplomacy has clearly changed with these new developments, not merely questioning and broadening what or who counts as a diplomat, but going beyond territorial claims and national boundaries to advocate on behalf of transnational groups, non-sedentary groups, and groups that have no fixed domicile. Diplomacy does not need to be rooted in a bordered world, nor merely, if ever, representing national interests, but we should continue to think about diplomacy as a political act aiming at democratic relations in a community context. Diplomacy should be different than mainstream mediation and not attempt to be neutral or to assume equality between parties. Diplomacy importantly transcends claims of facial neutrality to recognize inequalities and injustice. In this way, diplomats can admit that they do not represent everyone's views nor make problematic universal claims. As I will suggest, a broader definition of diplomacy is applicable to those who have instituted sanctuary locality practices as well as faith based sanctuary participants. Like other wealthy nation states, the US has narrowed the definition of a refugee, particularly after 9/11. Even in the 1980s, the US government did not recognize the massive flight of people from Central American wars as the actions of refugees. Indeed, the history of US migration policy mirrors the closure of the nation state that Arendt tracked in the interwar period. So, I'm going to tell you a bit about US migration policy because it was the specific context in which both sanctuary approaches emerged. Okay. So the historical roots of the contemporary US migration system help us to understand the emergence of sanctuary resistance. The decisions in the Chinese exclusion cases of the late 1800s are foundational to contemporary migration policy and instructive in understanding how detention and deportation were conceived of as dialectical opposites of prisons, punishment, and therefore personhood. So a lot of P's there. In the Chinese exclusion cases, the Supreme Court held that immigration was foreign policy and therefore rooted in plenary powers. The court maintained that only the executive and legislative branches have authority over matters of immigration. And so immigration policies and enforcement largely cannot be constitutionally scrutinized. In effect, at the federal level, foreigners can be treated as if they are on foreign soil. Courts' decisions are not bound by precedent, and enforcement is highly discretionary. The court also deemed immigration policy a civil and not a criminal matter, and detention and deportation are not, again, considered punishment. Accordingly, there is no right to counsel in the system, and ICE, which is the immigration police, does not have to maintain the same records or have the same level of transparency as do other public officials. While the plenary powers are concentrated in the federal government, states and municipalities were required to uphold the Constitution and until 1996 could not discriminate against foreign residents in state policies or enforcement. This division of powers created a dual system that largely protected foreign residents except when they crossed borders or interacted with federal agents. Resident foreigners who did not travel were often protected from discrimination and unequal treatment at the state and local level based on federal preemption of immigration powers. Personhood rights were often respected and strengthened in cases such as Plyler v. Doe. Territorial presence, community ties, and community belonging were taken into consideration over and above legal status. In a second, I'm going to tell you this is what sanctuary locality policies do, is to maintain this system. In contrast, Federal plenary powers have meant that arriving foreigners and resident foreigners who travel have not been provided guarantees of free speech, due process, equal protection, or protection against cruel and unusual punishment. That's just among other things. In 1996, the plenary power doctrine was partially devolved to the states in matters of anti-terror and welfare. This devolution has largely increased the rightlessness of resident foreigners at the state level, permitted mass detention. We've always had detention, but at the mass level is a key facet of policy, and expanded the use of removal or deportation proceedings triggered by state policing. So migrants' personhoods rights at the state level have diminished or disappeared depending on the context. Since 1996, new arrivals and resident foreigners face indefinite detention and forced removal to their countries of origin. Since the events of 9/11, policies have become harsher for people arriving at border points without previous authorization. Refugees and other migrants have been treated even worse since 2017, when the Trump administration was established, including the administration's discursive attacks on migrants, caging unaccompanied children, there's a picture to your right, separating families at the border and putting the children up for adoption, and instituting various travel bans. However, these policies were not illegal nor unprecedented. Today, these policies have been maintained through other means. In brief, the policies are legal but unconstitutional. Faith-based sanctuary and sanctuary localities, which are two different things, therefore do not operate in a constitutionally authorized zone, even as they invoke rights of personhood and human rights obligations. The U.S. faith-based sanctuary movement first arose in the 1980s in response to the U.S. government's criminalization of refugees fleeing the violence of Central American wars. This movement criticized U.S. foreign policy under Reagan as his administration funded and armed opposition to socialism, broadly conceived. As victims of government repression fled north, they were not treated as genuine refugees when they arrived in this country. This was partly because their flight demonstrated how destructive U.S. foreign policy in that region was. Admitting them as refugees would also be an admission that foreign policy intervention led to increased violence and displacement. A second issue is a refusal to view these migrants as having been subject to political persecution, because the U.S. began to frame migrants and refugees as economic migrants and therefore unworthy of refugee status. Important figures working between these countries were Catholic clergy, but as the movement emerged, other faith groups and politically motivated individuals also joined. This is an instance of what David Wellman has called an interconvictional grassroots movement, which is not merely interfaith, but broadly inclusive of individuals of all beliefs, including atheists and agnostics. Politico-ethical goals that united this diverse group were notions of hospitality, democratic inclusion, and an understanding of the importance of asylum. As governments refused to recognize refugees' claims and detain some individuals, the movement worked on several fronts. Sanctuary leaders challenged U.S. foreign policy and exposed the harm of funding conservative opposition groups in Central America to the American public. It struggled to rectify the status of all migrants fleeing these conflicts. It worked within these countries to expose and resist political oppression, and it aided migrants' flights to the U.S. border, as well as facilitating pathways to safe cities once they were inside. These leaders and participants confronted the warfare state, a state that operates differently than one guided by the rule of law. There were divisions within the movement which helped to elucidate significant tensions within the Catholic Church and the American public more broadly. Despite or because of these tensions, the movement was successful in several ways, from helping to expose bad foreign policy to rectifying the legal status of most refugees. To a much lesser degree, sanctuary localities arose at the same time, aiding the faith-based movement and challenging federal authorities' characterization of Central American refugees as illegal. These localities importantly asserted resident foreigners' personhood, upholding constitutional protections in the face of extra-constitutional policing, dealing with displaced peoples. Fewer in number than today, they were forerunners in modeling non-compliance with federal authorities and ensuring that resident foreigners could seek medical care, pursue education, and enact their right to the city, just like their neighbors. Sanctuary localities have increasingly emerged to uphold the dual system largely in effect in the 20th century. This has meant that state and local authorities have upheld the 14th Amendment rights of resident foreigners, even as federal authorities mostly suspend these protections. The designation of states, counties, and/or cities as sanctuaries is a direct reaction to the expansion of borders and the diminishment of foreigners' rights. Sanctuary is thus an open response to a particular legal context. In this way, U.S. sanctuary is historically and geographically specific, even if there are comparable movements in similarly situated countries. U.S. sanctuary localities might more accurately be called resistance localities, as Manfredi Sanchez suggests, cities of refuge, or constitutional localities, to help others understand that these sites are not free of extra-constitutional policing, nor do they actively interrupt or interfere with this policing. Rather, they refuse cooperation with these powers. This refusal is important to protect residents of Chicago, Cook County, and the state of Illinois. While each form of sanctuary is very different, their aims were and are complementary. Sanctuary localities are operating within a constitutional context, but faith-based sanctuary is more explicitly transnational and a more active form of resistance to unjust federal policies. As I've stated, from the 1980s on, the U.S. movement has involved activism in the country of origin, facilitating individuals' flight from the country when necessary and providing housing in the U.S. Unlike the new sanctuary movement that emerged in 2007, 1980s activists created an underground railroad for these individuals. The new sanctuary movement, which began in Chicago in 2007, is informed by these tactics from the 1980s and supported by many of its leaders, but there are key differences. There is no underground railroad, even if there is broad information sharing across cities, as well as national level meetings of the new sanctuary movement. There's less secrecy in the newer sanctuary movement, and migrant participants are at the center of all activities, defining their needs and framing their narratives. The 1980s sanctuary movement brought would-be refugees into the country, whereas today's faith-based movement largely tries to prevent the detention and deportation of long-term residents, even if it also does aid entry into the country, as well as helping new arrivals. Elvira Arellano's sanctuary participation in Chicago in 2007 is considered the event that sparked the new sanctuary movement and demonstrates the new impetus for this activity, preventing arbitrary detention and forced removal of a long-term resident. Unlike the previous movement, current sanctuary participants are from a broad range of countries, and individuals have very complex and very varied stories. The one unifying factor in all stories is the injustice of U.S. migration policy. Since 2007, faith-based sanctuary is involved in an offer that is extended to an individual or individuals who believe they will soon be detained and deported. They must live in the religious part of the faith-based institution until their situation has been resolved. This is because ICE treats faith-based institutions as sensitive areas, and despite breaching other sensitive areas in the past few years, they have not yet interfered in these sites. Leading up to this point, clergy and activists must convince parishioners to extend this offer and ensure that they understand the need for radical action. On the day that this action is announced, the press is called, and activists form a human chain around the structure. The participants tell their stories and explain their resistance to forced removal. Speeches, petitions, and other communication educate the public about the individual and why criminalizing rhetoric is not just incorrect, but damaging. In shielding individuals from arbitrary arrest and forced removal, faith-based sanctuary challenges the subjection of resident foreigners to neo-imperial racist policies that disproportionately police certain migrant groups over others. These testimonials about the sanctuary seekers' background undermine claims about their criminalization. They pressure ICE agents and local police, if relevant, to reverse their determinations, and they publicize the injustice of each potential deportation. Sanctuary participation must occur in a place of worship, but it necessarily involves the media and community to be successful. So it's really interesting from a democratic standpoint. Perhaps for this reason, actions are most often successful, depending on the case, and often lead to reviews of cases and positive outcomes. The offer of sanctuary is both legal and yet extra legal, in keeping with more ancient notions of sanctuary as a sacred place that should not be violated by temporal powers. As in the past, it is the institution that is sacred and which thus far has not been violated by ICE, while the individual is only safe insofar as they don't step outside. So I'm going to give you an example of a positive sanctuary case. In the fall of 2014, a woman named Beatriz sought sanctuary in a Chicago church. Prior to her sanctuary, she had filed for a U visa because she was the victim of a violent sexual assault on U.S. soil and had cooperated with the police per U visa stipulations. However, the police failed to affirm that she was cooperative with their investigation. This happens a lot. And she received a notice of deportation. Rather than abiding by the notice of removal, she was offered sanctuary by Father Jose Landaverde, may he rest in power, at Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission. When she accepted the offer, she and her 2 citizen children moved into the church and could not leave. Faith leaders, the press, and community members formed a human chain around the building. Individuals and groups held press conferences, talks, and masses with Beatriz and her family, while also giving her food and diapers since she was ineligible to work. Beatriz and her supporters educated the public about what types of individuals and circumstances are framed as illegal in the immigration context, countering damaging and inaccurate discourses. Most interestingly, with more protest and media coverage, the police finally affirmed that she had been cooperative in their investigation and her status has been regularized. This example evidences that sanctuary is a form of active and effective resistance to undemocratic sovereign powers. The protest centers on the particular sanctuary seeker's needs and story, actively involving her in the entire process. The fact that sanctuary often works, as with Beatriz's case, is evidence that even the power of the sovereign state can be challenged and reconstituted. Sanctuary localities, which have historically worked with faith-based activists, also do important work in reconstituting power, even if their main job is non-compliance and just upholding the Constitution. Faith-based sanctuary is a particularly good model to understand how sanctuary movements are transnational, not bordered, and historically embedded, not new, nor crisis-driven. One could translate this as a series of diplomatic attempts to bridge ideational and physical barriers in the political sphere. I am defining diplomacy as political in the best sense of the word, as defined by, for example, Hannah Arendt and Sheldon Wallen. And I assume that justice, inclusion, and peacemaking are goals of diplomats. Diplomacy should not be mediation because mediation entails the presupposition of the equality of parties. Mediation outcomes replicate the status quo based on reliance on master narratives that inaccurately describe the situation of marginalized parties. As a model of diplomacy as moral duty and aiming at social justice, sanctuary participants and activists are diplomats that question insurmountable physical barriers, who aim at broadly inclusive forms of justice and understand that civil solutions must counter the violence of the militarized nation state. Neutrality is not the goal. Social justice, fairness, equality, and community are. This is not realist politics. It is not realism, but is rather based in authentic, everyday experiences of people in the community. 2 important examples in Chicago are CRLN and ICDI, which has recently changed its name, which have historically questioned U.S. foreign policy in Central America since the 1980s, exposing grave injustices and working within these countries for democratic reform. These groups have facilitated travel to this country, aided individuals in seeking refuge in welcoming cities, and sought policy change to rectify their illegal status. They have essentially treated borders as mere obstacles, but not as defining nor restraining their activities. They do not stop there. They foster community. They train community members to accompany migrants to various appointments, and they provide crucial information to people in the city that otherwise people would not have. They enact a form of urban diplomacy that, as David Wellman defines it, amounts to acts of diplomacy which take place within the bounds of a single city, which may or may not have national or international implications. This includes diplomatic acts on a far more granular scale involving, I just stopped speaking English well, sorry, highly localized, intimate acts of diplomacy from neighbor to neighbor that can reverberate across an entire metropolis. Faith-based sanctuary activities involve a single case, but the mode of protest is inherently transnational, even if it appears to be profoundly local. So-called third world migrants stage a confrontation with first world migrant enforcement agents, illuminating not only unjust policies, but challenging discourses of illegality, educating the public about political persecution that forced them to flee from their country of origin, as well as dangerous journeys to US borders. All of this is so, so important in understanding the entire context of a migrant's arrival in the city of Chicago. As they communicate about each facet of their experience, they challenge the notion that political activity, including political persecution, must be understood inside or outside borders. For example, quite a lot of difficulties that migrants encounter when traveling to a border can be traced to US funded policing in other countries, and semi private detention centers also funded by the US. Dangerous walls that now cause severe concussions and back injuries, detention centers that catch fire, dangerous transportation like La Bestia are outside US borders and yet heavily influenced by US policy, pressures, and norms. Faith-based sanctuary allows a family or individual to convey their particular stories, to contextualize a complex set of issues, and to explode the notion of illegality. In resisting arbitrary jailing and forced displacement by US migration police, they chip away at the state's purported monopoly on violence. Sanctuary localities provide a positive context for these activities. Ironically, Donald Trump's administration fostered the growth of sanctuary localities as they expanded from cities to counties and states to combat increasingly unconstitutional migration policing. As this president characterized Central American or third world migrants as illegals, criminals, and more, he also defined sanctuary localities as fostering criminality and sanctuary policies as illicit. This notion is evident in southern states' governors' forced displacement of Venezuelan migrants now to sanctuary localities, as they argue that sanctuary localities attract so-called illegal migrants. As I have stated, sanctuary localities do the opposite. They uphold key constitutional provisions protecting rights associated with personhood in the 14th Amendment. Sanctuary localities do not merely refuse to comply with federal authorities, but model alternative methods to protect rights and challenge the injustice of migration policy. They create an alternative political community that is inclusive of all residents. In these respects, these localities are a form of urban diplomacy. Sanctuary localities exercise urban diplomacy in the recognition of all residents within their jurisdiction as persons despite absence of documents, foreign city of birth, and other questions of alienage. They presume that all residents are criminally innocent until proven otherwise. In this way, even sanctuary border cities recognize the inherent humanity and dignity of individuals located in zones that have been designated as constitution-free. Accordingly, sanctuary localities do not merely reinstate constitutional protections, but also refuse to recognize borders as they are currently configured. These localities model a politics of democratic equality in which humans are legally legible, regardless of country of origin. Chicago is a sanctuary city. This county, Cook County, sorry about the horrible picture, is a sanctuary locality, and Illinois is a sanctuary state. At the most minimal level, this means that police and other officials should not investigate the migration status of individuals they encounter, nor are they obligated to turn these people into ICE. At its best, these policies model non-compliance with racist enforcement, question rigid territorial boundaries, and model democratic inclusion for other localities. This allows at least a younger generation to thrive and move beyond the displacement and persecution their parents experienced as they are included in this community. While solidarity cities in Europe might have more explicit formal relations, the mayors and administrators of U.S. sanctuary localities do share wording for legislation, they share tactics, and they discuss various obstacles that they've encountered. They are often, if not every day, in conversation with civil society groups, migrant advocates, and migrants themselves. For these reasons, sanctuary locality leaders could be viewed as practicing some form of city diplomacy, as authors such as Harold Botter, Saskia Sassen, and David Wellman have explored separately and perhaps not using that term. However, recognizing the transnational character of both forms of sanctuary perhaps bridges these two ideal types of diplomacy, city and urban. Sanctuary localities and faith-based sanctuary each oppose the injustice of migration policy and policing, but they operate at very different levels. They are both political in that they involve a community, they foster education and discussion for the public benefit, and they urge decision makers to adhere to a set of inalienable rights, whether constitutional or human, that are explicitly stated and available for all to understand. What I'm suggesting is not merely a different set of actors regarding who counts as a diplomat, but the establishment of a different set of bonds, relationships, and political tools created and deployed by transnational groups than elite level diplomacy. We can think of the two approaches to diplomacy, city and urban, again, as two ideal types that have overlaps, gray areas, and which are bridged and superseded by the example of sanctuary localities and faith-based sanctuary. Considered together, urban diplomacy and city diplomacy provide an example of how outward-facing municipal or state actions work together with democratizing tactics that appear to be purely local. This is not merely everyday diplomacy, but is deeply democratic and rooted in notions of equality and inherent human dignity. So we can discern something important in conceiving of diplomacy at this level, self-representation of those who have been marginalized rather than speaking for the other. Accordingly, the crucial link between urban and city diplomacy is diplomacy conducted by the affected parties rather than speaking on behalf of groups taken to be voiceless. If the word diplomacy should mean something beyond mere communication, the term can be expanded without suffering from facial neutrality. In considering the variety of literature and research on cosmopolitics, and so on and so forth, we can understand that each sphere contributes to a fuller understanding of the properly political dynamics of informal transnational acts of diplomacy. And so I want to call attention to the fact that while some argue that this should happen, that we should put scholars or that we should kind of recognize or like encourage democracy, that this has already been happening for decades. This is certainly true of the diplomacy of the faith-based sanctuary movement since the 1980s. So I'm just going to try to wrap this up. Faith-based sanctuary and sanctuary localities do different but complementary decolonial diplomatic work on behalf of the notion of social justice. This cannot be an elite activity. Since the 1980s, sanctuaries involved integrative modes of participation that help to establish parallel groupings that continuously democratize transnational spaces and relations. Thank you so much for having me and for listening. I welcome your comments.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really wonderful, and you've covered an extraordinary amount of territory. This is not my area, but I do notice that several people have asked questions, and I just want to remind people in the audience that if they'd like to ask Katie a question, please do go to the Q&A portal at the bottom, and you can basically put your question there, and I'll direct that to Katie. I've got a couple of questions lined up, Katie, and here's the first one. It touches on the issue that you, I think, delved into towards the end of your remarks, and that is this idea of who counts as a diplomat. Now, you also problematize that away from the state-based international relations view of the diplomat, which is essentially someone who represents the state in a formally accredited way. The question I have for you is, Antonio Alejo writes of the notion of migrants as being themselves diplomatic actors. He uses the term migrant diplomacy and argues that migrants coming to Chicago from Mexico City are in fact builders of a diplomatic bridge between these two cities. What do you see as the potential of this way, which is a fairly optimistic way, I think, but nonetheless, what do you see as the potential of this way of characterizing migrants as a means of helping more people to recognize not only their humanity, but their vital role in bringing our two countries closer together?
Yeah, I think what I just argued is aligned with Alejo's arguments about migrant protesters or migrants themselves as enacting forms of diplomacy. And so certainly it also calls attention to the political aspects of their migration rather than simply seeing it as individual or part of a push-pull model. So it's a way to see this as properly political and to contextualize their actions and efforts as perhaps critical as responding to policies and as having a message and not merely just coming here to get a job.
Yes,
So
no, that's very.
support that.
Yeah, no, I very much had that sense that you were lining up or heading in very much the same direction as Antonio. So thanks very much for that response. Another question I have here, and this really brings us into, in a sense, the here and now and the political day, the political moment, if you like. And here's the question: how is the current presidential campaign impacting the issue and the issues that you're considering? Trump is still around, and he is competing with Governor DeSantis, who is actually trying to out-Trump Trump on these kinds of issues in some respects. Would you like to comment on how the current presidential campaign, and there's a deeper aspect to this question that I interpret, at least, is that a presidential campaign is an important democratic event. Donald Trump may not think that, nonetheless, many of us do. And so therefore, here is democracy on show, on parade in the United States, and it might make matters worse. This is my editorial comment on the question, but I wanted you to weigh back in and say, how are you reading this campaign in terms of what it's going to do to this issue?
President Biden's policies are largely aligned with Trump's. I understand that Trump is much more hostile in his rhetoric. Biden has done almost very similar, if not identical, policies at the border, including right now, children are still being separated. There are reports at the border of people still being caged. There is not the same sort of policing by ICE where they're just pulling people out of hospitals. So I don't want to say that there's nothing that's different between the two politicians, but I do think that Biden's policies are some of the worst policies of any Democratic president in recent years. And so, yes, we can criticize Trump until we get rid of the plenary power doctrine and undermine the legal foundations of what's been called a blank check for the president and even Congress. We will continue to have people acting outside of this. But just because Biden does not use hostile rhetoric does not mean he hasn't replicated down to the last caged child very similar policies. Sorry to be so cynical.
Thank you, Katie. Now, in fact, you just mentioned the plenary powers doctrine, and one of the audience asked the following question, which I think. Let me ask the question. Could you expand a bit on how the plenary powers doctrine continues to distort US immigration policy?
Sure. So the doctrine itself removes constitutional scrutiny from migration policies and policing. And this started in Chinese exclusion. So it started out as explicitly racist. And various examples would just be like deporting someone who has not been accused of a crime, and you don't take the community participation or long-term ties that they have to the U.S. community into consideration. You treat them as if they're a foreigner on foreign soil. So you depress or suppress a number of factors that would otherwise weigh in the person's favor. And so it's been called a blank check for the president and Congress. We have a history of both racist policies that ended in 1965, but racist enforcement since then, or some people like the term selective enforcement. And so the absence of checks and balances, the absence of transparency makes this an undemocratic system. It violates all of the precepts of democratic government.
Okay, thank you so much. And here's another one for you. What do you think are the most fruitful strategies to promote a deeper level of collaboration among urban and city diplomats in order to expand sanctuary efforts?
I think one thing might be that we could see in these efforts a bridge between the two rather than thinking there needs to be a collaboration because the two terms appear to be different. I would say let's change the definition or view them as ideal types, and then the real life activism or policies are actually examples of both.
Yeah, very good. I see another question here, and this one, I'm not sure if I'm following, but nonetheless, here's something along the lines of that you talked about, you made a very important distinction between sanctuary localities and faith-based sanctuaries. And I wondered if this essentially meant that there are cases where you're saying sacred spaces actually have real advantages over secular or constitutional ones. And this is sort of an interesting take on, let's say, those people who might argue that interconvictional is a good way to go because it sort of displaces, let's say, religious and sacred solutions and approaches with a kind of a secular interconvictional one. But you're actually saying don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's my language if I'm trying to interpret this question. So I wonder if you could just, go into that a little bit more about why is it that a faith-based sanctuary has such an advantage in certain situations in protecting people. And you did give at least one really quite notable example.
Yes, I mean, it might be unfortunate that we use the word sanctuary for sanctuary cities. They're really, they're not sanctuary. They just uphold the 14th Amendment. So that's one of the reasons I've advocated for the use of the word constitutional cities. It also reminds people that they're merely upholding the Constitution, like the 5th and 14th Amendment, personhood rights and guarantees of equal protection and due process. Faith-based sanctuary is much more active. ICE has not breached it. So from a tactical level, yes, it's the one sensitive area that was not breached by ICE under Trump. Whereas hospitals were breached, schools were breached, and so on and so forth. And so churches, for some reason, appeal to people, or they view that as a sacred space and respect that, whereas they did not respect children going to school or people who were getting operations. So I suppose from a tactical standpoint, sure. But I do want to tell people, very often they think I'm talking about Christianity. Synagogues have been there the whole time. And then you've also had Muslim involvement at the grassroots since at least 2007, and then various attempts by imams to also do sanctuary, and it was unsuccessful, at least in the United States.
Yeah,
right?
Very good. And I think in your, Sanctuary in a Trumpist Context article, you make that point very nicely, which I do appreciate. I do have another question for you, Katie, and I'll read it. Can you define your term conventional mediation? In your understanding, can transprofessional diplomacy bring in an understanding of mediation that is distinct from your use of the term conventional mediation? Thank you. And
Yes. Sorry, go
go right ahead.
I'm inspired by the work of Leo Wing, who is a professor at the University of Massachusetts and is doing what I would call work that's very aligned with Michel Foucault's work, where you realize that mediation, which is often prescribed by the state and is used in a variety of contexts, including peace negotiations, does not recognize. So conventional mediation assumes the equality of parties. Conventional mediation assumes the equality of resources going into a negotiation. So we could see perhaps in the Middle East, if we call something a conflict, even using those sorts of words, right, fails to appreciate the depth of asymmetries of power. The last thing that Leo Wing says, and I really encourage people to look up her work because she's trying to retrain mediators. And that is that master narratives more often align with the status quo understandings of power relations. And if the person speaks first, they set that master narrative and the mediator hears it and they assume that they're neutral. And then someone who is other and marginalized, and that's why I like saying this is decolonial, has to very often spend twice the amount of time undermining the master narrative, and they very often are not believed. And so that's my brief synopsis of the importance of her work. And I teach that in my classes now when I teach conflict negotiation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I can just add my own thought of a quick supplementary thought to that. Can you think of any cases where, in fact, the biased mediator might be an advantage? And a highly controversial example here would be the United States in relation to the Middle East. So that, in other words, the argument would be something along the lines of there's only one mediator that can really, let's say, help produce some kind of lasting settlement here, and that is the United States. But it's clearly, let's say, inclined in the favor of one party. So is there a theory of mediation, or not a theory, but is there a school of thought which basically says something like, under certain circumstances, the let's say the powerful mediator is actually an asset in finding a solution to the problem? So that's really a question of ignorance from my part in terms of the mediation literature. And if anyone in the audience wants to weigh in on that, please go to the Q&A section as well. Katie, did you have a quick thought on that?
Yes, so I do teach decolonial theory, and I do teach Leah Wing's ideas that I think are consonant with decolonial theory. The United States benefits from its relationship with Israel and should never be the mediator, right? When you have people living on less than $2 a day and who have been deprived and confined into a certain area, right? You have deep asymmetries. This is not a conflict, right? So even using the word conflict or war is assuming that the equality of parties. This is not to justify anything that Hamas has done, but the U.S. is absolutely biased in its in a multitude of ways, including our dependence on oil, right? And I would say guilt over not helping Jewish people during the Holocaust, but that's my own theory. So I was advocating for forms of diplomacy that do not fall into the traps of mainstream or conventional mediation as defined by Leah Wing, but which are also voiced by the other. So an example would be in the media recently, there have been reports of canceling interviews with people from Palestine or canceling interviews or not posting interviews with people who are of Arabic descent in the past 2 weeks, right? I am advocating for people the most affected by policies get to speak and define their needs. People should not speak on behalf of others when they have not been authorized to do so. And this is an idea that Linda Alcoff discusses in Speaking for the Other.
Katie, thank you very much. That really is a very sophisticated and challenging response, and I really do appreciate it. From a personal point of view, my perspective on this is very much of a traditional state-based one, but I think the level of thought and sophistication in your view there I really do appreciate it very much, I have to say. So I'm just looking down to the chat function, and I'm just looking into the Q&A to see if we have any more questions. And you know what, Katie? I don't think we do. So I think at this point, it just remains for me to thank you very much for an incredibly sophisticated paper and presentation. I really look forward to the next iteration of your ideas. So please do let us know when your next piece is coming out, because I think there are a lot of people in applied diplomacy and in our network who would be very interested in the very important range of views that you present. So I really do want to thank you so much for your remarks and your keynote address. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you very much.